So my name is Tamara, and I'm a Policy Development Officer in the City of Toronto's Children's Services Division, and we're responsible for working with service providers across the City of Toronto to meet the needs of children and families. The specific work that I do within this division is really exciting because I lead a project that we lead called Raising the Village. And Raising the Village gathers, analyzes, and displays data about the well-being of children and families. So I have kind of a cool job within government. I'm gonna kind of talk about three things, and there's a fourth that I forgot to add to this. But first, I'm gonna kind of highlight why data-driven decision-making is important, generally in sort of the social services context, but specifically in the context of Toronto, which I'm gonna speak about a little bit. And then I'm gonna talk about how Tableau has become a really critical tool for understanding this data in a more meaningful way, especially when it comes to action. And then finally, a little bit about some of the internal uses of Tableau. Raising the Village is a public external project, so there are some internal pieces that we do use Tableau for. And lastly, I did want to provide quite a bit of time for questions because I find the format of this kind of presentation is always a little weird because I want to talk a lot about Tableau and a little bit about the project, but I find I don't really cover everything on either of those, so it'd be good if you guys can guide me with some questions afterwards, or if I don't get into some of the details that you want to know. So yeah, that's sort of the agenda. So to start, I don't know, but maybe many of you might be surprised to know that Toronto is Canada's child poverty capital, and it has been for many years in a row now. Toronto, I think, is probably more so known as being kind of Canada's hub or the largest city in Canada, and it does rank quite high on a number of these indexes, like being the most livable city or having a highly thriving financial and tech sector. However, the reality, which I don't think is untrue of many other of these world-class cities, is that the opportunities that come with being high up on these sorts of lists are really only available to some. And there are really huge disparities between those who are thriving and those who are not. So in Toronto today, 26% of our children are living in poverty, and many children and families lack access to the supports they need, which leads to huge differences in well-being outcomes. So before I begin to talk about the type of data that we look at and the type of data that we analyze to measure well-being, I think it's important to understand what daily life might look like for a lot of children in Toronto. So I'm going to just tell a really cheesy, quick story about a boy named Ben that I think illustrates the patterns and brings to life some of the data that I'll be talking about later. So Ben goes to school in the morning without breakfast, mostly because there isn't food available at home. He walks to school, but along the way he doesn't always feel safe. So when he gets to school, he's feeling quite anxious, and as a result finds it hard to concentrate in class. He's been struggling academically because of this and has performed poorly on all these standardized tests that get handed out. He'd really like to take part in some after-school art classes, but his mom is unable to make it home from her multiple jobs and bring him to and from art class. So Ben is not experiencing optimal well-being. And Ben's story is really not unique. This reflects actually what the majority of children are experiencing in one neighborhood in Toronto called Thorncliffe Park. In this neighborhood, over 60% of children are living in poverty, and over half are not participating in programs like arts and sports and early learning and childcare, which we know can lead to positive outcomes down the road. So we know that, like Ben, a lot of children in Toronto are not experiencing well-being, and for a long time, we've heard these stories kind of told to us firsthand and through narratives. And this is where Raising the Village really comes in. The purpose of Raising the Village is really to provide data to communities to help drive data-driven decision-making, policy development, and program planning. And what makes this project unique is that it only uses population-level data. So that means that the majority of Toronto's children are captured within this data. And as I'm sure we all know, we live in a data-rich world now, and this is also true even though some people might might laugh at this, it is true in government. I think there is a lot of data about the services that we provide and who might be accessing them. But what population level data does for us is it helps us to understand who might not be accessing those programs or who might be falling through the cracks, which is data that we really, for a long time, haven't really been able to get to. So at the heart of Raising the Village are 5 child and 5 family outcomes, and they seem probably like they make sense and super basic and simple, but these were developed through a really extensive community-led process, which actually took a number of years to actually pin down these 5 family and 5 child outcomes. But they do span multiple domains of well-being, and they together define what we hope all children and families can achieve. They're also rooted in research and research about child development. And they also provide a really important framework for understanding what we need to measure, which also provides a framework for understanding where the data gaps might be, which has been critical for moving this project forward. So right now on Raising the Village, we have over 40 indicators measuring child well-being indicators, and we're going to be launching the family indicators in the coming months. But because this framework has been articulated and grasped on so firmly, we are able to be really clear about the data that we want and need and move forward in filling those data gaps. So more and more indicators are going to be added to this project. And I can talk a little bit more later on about what the data is or are. So just to start, now that we kind of have this framework and all of this data, there's some really important stories that begin to emerge. So we know in Toronto, and I know that you are probably not familiar with Toronto, but I think this is probably true of many places, but we know that poverty plays out in a really stark geographic pattern. So in Toronto, there's like this very wealthy area here, which has like, I guess, Garden District style houses, whatever. There's a whole, Drake lives in a like $28 million house somewhere around here. And then there's like the downtown core, which a lot of the yuppies are kind of moving in and pushing people out. And that's like the story of Toronto, which I think is probably the story of many places. And so these sort of inner suburban areas, they're called, have lots of pockets of poverty, as well as some of these areas here, which are actually where social housing has been preserved and remains, which is a really good thing because it's walking distance to employment and stuff like this. But there's huge disparities between neighborhoods. So there's some neighborhoods where less than 4% of children are living in poverty. For example, this one right here, and other neighborhoods where over 60% of children are living in poverty, which is actually right beside it here. So these neighborhoods are often separated by a road. And we see very similar geographic patterns playing out across a number of the other indicators that we have on Raising the Village. So this one is a map that shows participation in arts and sports programming, and you can see that it's pretty much almost identical, if not more stark, to that poverty map. So we do see that there's a clear correlation between a family's income and participating in these programs. This map is literally identical as well to the participation in early learning and childcare programs map. And again, we know that participating in these programs is beneficial for kids for a number of reasons. Lastly, I'm going to show this map, which again, we see a very similar pattern emerge. And this is a map that is about children who feel unsafe in their community. So what you see is that where you live has a real lived impact on your experience and your well-being outcomes. From seeing this map and using this data, we actually have gone in and done some really intensive child engagement and have learned some really interesting things about public space and what feels safe for kids. So in some neighborhoods, kids feel like there's a lot of places they can go and they feel safe and that they're meant for them. So parks, for example, kids in a lot of neighborhoods feel that parks are meant for kids and they love going there. But there's other neighborhoods where there's a real difference with that experience. So there's been instances of gun violence or very extreme police presence, and some kids really do not feel comfortable walking around or going to parks, and there really aren't any public spaces that they feel are meant for them. So you can start to understand through these static maps some of the complex and layered struggles that children and families face in Toronto. And when we first launched Raising the Village, I think now 2 or 3 years ago, all of these indicators were displayed in this way. So they were all static maps using ArcGIS or static graphs looking at this stuff by income, and it really only provided a snapshot of what's happening. So Raising the Village is spearheaded and primarily used by a network called the Toronto Child and Family Network. And this network includes all the services and sectors that you can pretty much think of that have an impact on children. So it ranges from like our Parks and Recreation Department to hospitals, schools, childcare, United Way, which is like a funding organization for kind of community groups. And the leaders and executive directors of these services all sit around this network, and together they have the collective capacity, if they work together, to really improve the lives of Toronto's children. But as you can see from this diagram, this network is not only huge and complex, but it also operates at completely different scales. So the executive directors sitting around this network, these maps might really speak to them, and these kind of high-level stories about the sort of geographic patterns that are happening might mean a lot to them, but the reality also is that many organizations work at a community level, and a lot of the actual action and impact is going to happen down at the community level. So a big question kind of emerged, and this is where Tableau became a really critical piece of the project, and that question was, how can we understand how children are doing, both at this macro level, but also down at a micro or community-based level. And I meant to say this before, but just for context, like Toronto, maybe this isn't big in the States, but Toronto is a big city. We have like over 2.7 million people just in Toronto proper, and then it's over 5 million in sort of the core. So this question of scale is quite large when we're talking about that many people. So yeah, so this was really the question that led us down the path of finding Tableau and falling in love with it. It was, needing to have this level of interactivity and this ability to drill down. And I'm going to now kind of exit out of this presentation and bring you to the website to show you what we've done. So. Also, I don't know, for those that work in government, you might know this, but just to get a single Tableau license at the City of Toronto and Children's Services was like a 1.5-year process of talking to various departments and making the case that, like, I essentially had to build the entire dashboard to prove that it could do what I wanted to do, and like, this is probably not new to anybody in government, but it was a job just to get a single license. So. Yeah, so this is the Raising the Village website. There's like a ton of different resources on here. Actually, before I go into this, I'm just gonna show you, there's an inequity score, which is like a composite index to try and understand need. There's a social identity toolkit, which is sort of a disaggregated data warehouse. We're really focused in Toronto particularly on disaggregating data by race. This is something that really hasn't been done a lot, especially in Canada. People are really like uncomfortable about talking about race. I think people are a little more comfortable in the States. It's like been talked about and analyzed in this way for a long time. But in Toronto, we see real discrepancies in well-being outcomes also based on not only geography, but race as well. So it's important for us to be able to disaggregate that and analyze it to point to it. But anyways, this is sort of the dashboard that ended up being created, which has been used by the network in a variety of organizations. It allows you to look at Toronto's 140 neighborhoods. These are sort of local planning units, but they're used for planning, but residents also really identify with their neighborhoods. There was like a lot of engagement to define what these areas would be. And it allows you to see kind of, you can click on a neighborhood. Whoop, that didn't work. Oh yeah, this always happens. Sorry, I meant to reload it. So you can click on a neighborhood and see how that neighborhood is doing across all of the data that we have. So this neighborhood, for example, is Glenfield Jane Heights. It ranks very high on our inequity score, which means that it has like, there's lower income families, families with lower education, unemployment, et cetera. And you can see sort of across the board that children in this neighborhood are generally not doing as well as other neighborhoods. There are some sort of counters to that story though. So, I mean, it's simple, like red equals kind of performing poorly and blue equals performing well. Oh, for example, Bridle Path, that's where Drake lives. So kids in the Bridle Path feel fine at school, don't feel unsafe at school. Yeah, so this provides you with sort of that drill down look at all of our indicators by neighborhood. But we've also added some important kind of census variables. Toronto is, I don't know how they've come to this conclusion, but I have heard that Toronto is the most diverse city in the world. So we now have more, what the census calls visible minorities than not visible minorities. So there's less than 50% white people in Toronto. We have a high percentage of refugees, a lot of immigrants, and a ton of people that don't speak English or French as their most common language at home. So a very diverse community. So it's really important as service providers for us to be able to understand like what language is spoken in that neighborhood, how many refugees might be there, because if you're providing a program like a child and family program, you need to understand what sort of referrals and stuff you can provide to families coming to that neighborhood. So this has been used by us for internal planning uses. It's been used across the city by different community organizations to understand what's going on in the community that they work in. And it's a pretty simple dashboard. It's just using a bunch of dashboard actions to highlight and click and then highlight on here what the neighborhood. It also has some cool parameters that let you see some of these census variables on the map. So we can look at, for example, if you want to know where white people live in Toronto, it might not be surprising that white people live in these like very wealthy neighborhoods. So our city is also kind of divided by race in a way that a lot of cities still are here, I think. If you wanted to look at poverty, you could do that. Yeah, immigrants, refugees, you can see the map in a bunch of different ways. So that's sort of the tool that sparked the Tableau use at Children's Services. From there, actually I'll show you one other thing. The other cool thing is when it was first launched, like I said, everything was really static. And now, but I'm the only one that really works on this project. So slowly but steadily, I'm trying to, every time I kind of update something, it's really all just being updated using Tableau now. So our child and family inequity score, which is used as sort of a really quick understanding of sort of like priority neighborhoods that people might want to focus resources on, used to just be a static map in an Excel spreadsheet that we would give to people. So now it has a little more interactivity. I use the Vision tooltip to allow people to just see sort of the makeup. So the inequity score is made up of 5 custom census variables for families with children 0 to 12. So you can see sort of how this score was made up and the percentages for each of those five variables, as well as some info about population. I also was able to kind of do this cool thing, which before we hadn't really understood this pattern as well, but this is just looking at the inequities score with the population. And what you can see at a glimpse, it's ordered by sort of high inequities to low inequities, is that when you start to scroll down, neighborhoods with higher inequities do seem to have higher population. So that maybe is not that surprising, but this chart kind of helps you to understand that. You can also just highlight the neighborhood that you live or work in or filter it here. Yeah. So now I'm going to quickly show you a little bit about some of the internal stuff that we've done. These dashboards, I will warn you, are not very pretty, but they, from sort of the Tableau, or sorry, the Raising the Village dashboard, I started to get some more and more requests coming from different managers across the division to help them kind of analyze their data. And from there, more and more managers are getting on board with getting Tableau themselves to start to do this stuff because they're understanding how easy it is. So this is an example of a project that I know nothing about because I work in policy and this is kind of operational, but we, for Children's Services, we're in charge of giving out childcare quality. We do a childcare quality assessment. And these people go around to all the different licensed childcares and they give them a score out of 5, but it's broken down into a number of different areas. So there were a number of questions that the manager of this quality unit had that had never really been answered before that Tableau sort of allowed for. Also for on-the-fly questions that we get all the time from counselors and the mayor and et cetera. So what this shows is all the different buildings on the right here, or here, I guess I could use this. All the different buildings that childcare are in, and then their average score out of 5. Also the auspice, so there's commercial childcare, nonprofit childcare, and then public childcare, which are run by us at Children's Services. We have 53 of them, and then by section. And you can start to understand sort of the differences in quality. And then down here, it's not super intuitive, but these are sort of how the quality score is given out. So it's a really weird, personally, I think it's a really weird score. But like, for example, you have music and accessories as a section, and then they go around and they give scores about whether or not musical instruments were accessible to the children. And if they were, they get an exceeds on this. And if they weren't, then it becomes a non-compliant. So you can start to see where non-compliants are coming in. So for example, like hand washing hygiene is a very high non-compliant score on these AQIs, which is a little concerning. Yes, but the real power is that you can start to drill down. And so like I said, at Children's Services, we directly operate these public child care centers, so I can look only at public and it will drill down just to our child care centers, and we can see sort of that child care centers in office buildings have the highest rating for some reason, followed by public schools, or this is kind of faulty, but public schools that are now closed, and so on. And then it will filter these as well to be specifically for the public auspice. I can also go down and see if I'm only interested in preschool or only interested in a certain building type. Yeah, so this was sort of the first foray into doing some of the internal dashboards, and from there it kind of exploded, and more dashboards have been made. I don't know if anyone else is experiencing this problem. I reported it to Tableau, but I won't be able to show you this one cool dashboard I did, but apparently custom shapefiles are down right now, and they've been down for a while. But anyways, this map looks weird. There's supposed to be a map under here. But essentially what I can start to do internally is take the stuff, so drop-in childcare centers, or these are actually child and family centers, which are different. They're free and accessible drop-in programs, and overlay it with some of that Raising the Village dashboard, Raising the Village indicators, and really start to make decisions about, for example, which neighborhoods we should increase the hours of our child and family programs in based on sort of their level of inequities or other indicators. Yeah, so that's what's been going on with, I'm just bringing you back here. At the City of Toronto with Children's Services. Now, so it started with just my license and my public license, or one desktop license and just being able to use public data that would be published to Tableau Public. And now there's slowly but surely more and more uptake, and we have Tableau Online, which is really exciting for some of that internal stuff because it's private data. We now have 2 other people that are making like some funny little dashboards, and 5 Explorer licenses, which are mostly used by people who are directly reporting to council and need to kind of on the fly answer different questions. So it's really exciting, and there's more and more interest, and what's also really cool is that across the city, across all these other divisions, there's also more and more interest. So I think it's becoming, Microsoft BI, I think, might be slowly pushed to the side for being sort of the visualization tool. Yeah, does anybody have any questions or want me to like dive into certain parts of Raising the Village? Yeah.
Your early charts showed poverty.
Mm-hmm.
High range was up to 63%.
Yeah.
And your last chart showed unsafe.
Mm-hmm.
Being unsafe, and high range was about 23 or 27%.
Mm-hmm.
The whole segment of people in poverty who didn't feel unsafe.
Mm-hmm.
So you correlated what factors other than poverty were leading to the poverty was not coming back.
Yeah, oh, for sure. Yeah, and that's a really good point and a really good, like there's a lot of data gaps too. The other point about Raising the Village is none of the data is really connected. Like we can't really track children across the different data sources. So even though they might be represented in one and another, there's so many privacy concerns that we can't really see like which children that are reporting feeling unsafe are also falling in the poverty measure. Because I think you're totally right. Like there's a lot related to even just transportation, so like the roadways in the neighborhood that might not be correlated with income, that kids are reporting feeling unsafe. I think there's probably a lot of like wealthy kids that are saying they're feeling unsafe in the neighborhood for various reasons, either like stranger danger or other things. But one thing that we're really trying to do at Children's Services is not use the data for everything. So one of the big initiatives that we're starting is a child engagement strategy. So really trying to understand, like kids have really interesting things to say about their lives and about what would make them better. So kind of using some of this data as a starting point to understand a lot of these nuances about what's really going on. So it's cool that way. Does anybody else have any questions? Oh, yeah.
What type of feedback have you received as you went public with your Tableau dashboard? And also, how are the public using it?
Oh, yeah. So really good feedback. I would say the one thing is like I kind of thought people would really jump on it and everyone would be using it. And I would say that people benefit the most when I'm able to come in and give like a really brief presentation about Raising the Village as a whole, go through all the different indicators and the data sets, and then jump into the dashboard and talk about how it works. But I would say that it's mostly being used by really by organizations who are on the ground who want to kind of, they work in this neighborhood and they'll print off like as a PDF this whole dashboard, blow it up and put it on their wall. It's been used a lot by organizations who are applying for grants and funding to help make their case. One example that I heard was this childcare supervisor childcare supervisors like really are not, they don't use data a lot for their planning. They are so their time is spent just like putting out fires all the time. They don't have a lot of time to like sit down and think about data and what it means and what the neighborhood, could use. But this one childcare supervisor saw that in EDI, which every single kindergarten student in Toronto gets an EDI score, which is an early development instrument score. And she saw that in her neighborhood, the vulnerable in physical development was really high. So a lot of children were vulnerable in physical development. And she apparently for years had been advocating for their school's gymnasium to be fixed. It was like under construction permanently. So the kids in that neighborhood who primarily went to that school hadn't been able to do any sort of gym class, at least through the winter, when it was snowing outside. And she used sort of this data to really help make the case that the Toronto District School Board had to get on providing the funding to fix that gymnasium up. And it worked. So it was that was a cool, like, I know it's really micro, but it was a cool use case to hear. I think for this project is at the city level, we do use data to plan a lot. We could do it more and more, but I think this project was really motivated to help community organizations or agencies on the ground start to use data to inform their program planning. Yeah, for me, what I would really want to see more and more of is people using this data for languages. So we've done some looking at, for example, these child and family programs, which are free and accessible, and the top languages that the staff in those programs speak, and comparing it to the top 3 languages in that neighborhood. And sometimes it's like bang on, but a lot of the time it's not. So we're trying to think about like how can we make these places really accessible to everyone, and how does language kind of come into that is an important factor. So it's kind of another way it's being used. Yeah.
So what's the plan next in terms of where you take this? Are you talking to other cities in Canada with similar ideas, or are you going to roll it out to a different part of government in Toronto?
I think like the plan is that, to me, there's so much data still on this website that isn't interactive that could be. There's like your point that you made, like there's a lot of kind of questions that I think I can build dashboards around and allow people to be more sort of interactive with the data. So like immediate next steps would be like dashboarding kind of more and more of this website. Like as an example, I'll just show you the social identity toolkit, which I talked about, which is just looking at very few of our data sources ask about race. This is like a really new thing in Canada. So the only one that actually does is our Toronto District School Board census. So it asks children and families to self-identify. There's only these 9 ethno-racial categories, which obviously are not very nuanced. But yeah, this is just a static like chart. So I would love to be able to allow people to play around with this kind of stuff a little bit more. Yeah, and talking to other cities for sure. I think like for me, I need to see kind of other dashboards to kind of understand where to go or for inspiration. So I think like Tableau, I see so many dashboards about sales and whatever, and it's hard sometimes to be inspired around sort of these well-being indicators and how to kind of bring them to life in a way that's meaningful. So any sort of, if you guys have places for me to look, send them my way. Yeah.
Do you know any other cities in
Yeah, there's actually a lot of cities that are trying to do this stuff. They're not very far along. Some of them are, so there's some cities that are really far along in terms of having a really strong child and family network kind of thing, that like the one that started this. But they don't really have that data piece down. So they have a network that does a lot of collaborative planning, sort of local needs assessment work together, but they're not really being driven by data. And then there's also the opposite. So I've seen cities where they have like these amazing dashboards that are full of all this data, but there isn't really a body behind it that's using it. So like, I think Raising the Village is a little bit cool because I kind of get to be like, holding this Toronto Child and Family Network accountable to what they're seeing in this data. Because like, so it's a bit of a kind of speaking to each other thing, which I think is really useful. So I'll show you like one thing that came out of all of this work, which is less related to Tableau, but actually it's kind of related to Tableau because when we launched raising the village, two things were said. One was this sort of like wanting to be able to interact with the data, drill down, and that's where Tableau came in. But the other thing was people were like, whoa, I am so overwhelmed by all of this data. I have no idea what to do with it. Even though I've been asking you to get this project done for like 5 years or whatever, they were like, now I don't know what to do. I'm just completely overwhelmed. So, which I thought was interesting because I thought they would be like jumping on this data and really excited. So what we learned, one thing that we learned is that another really important piece, and maybe you all know this, but another really important piece is the narrative part of it. So we created these we launched the project and both City Council and the network said, can you just please prioritize the most important things that came out of this and then tell us what to do? So we were like, okay. So I have a group of Toronto Child and Family Network advisors that help with this kind of stuff. So we all got together and we started trying to like synthesize and understand what the top priorities were, and we created these 5 data stories, which are really just like the top challenges facing children, and pulled from various data sources to try and just describe what these challenges are. And these were actually the thing that I think people like latched onto the most in terms of next steps and action. So the network, for example, asked for these, we created these, and now they're doing strategic planning, and they're actually using these as pillars for their sort of working tables. So this one, the opportunity gap, what's coming out of this is really coordinated local needs assessment. So for a long time, we as Children's Services might devote a bunch of money to doing like an in-depth needs assessment of a particular neighborhood that's being identified as high need. But then 2 years later, the public library realizes they also need to do that, and then they go and they do the same thing. And this neighborhood is becoming like what's it called? Consulted with and exhausted. And obviously we should be doing this stuff together because the answer often isn't just build a childcare center or build a library, it's something much more robust. So it's really cool because this kind of challenge has sparked a lot of work trying to do this coordinated needs assessment together. So I think having that sort of, I guess, accountability built in isn't that unique. But this project, the indicator stuff, everyone's trying to do it, I think, especially in government. Yeah. Yeah.
How are you tying the Tableau and the dashboards into tracking against the progress towards the outcomes that you mentioned at the beginning?
So, okay, so that's cool. And this is actually where inspiration for new dashboards would definitely be appreciated because all of these indicators were a snapshot in time, but one of the things that we needed for the indicators to have is that the data would be collected again so that we can start to track over time. So all of this data can be time trended, but it's often our richest data sources are like every 5 years. So right now, like in the next 6 months, we're going to be expecting to get our next like load of a lot of the data. So the census, for example, just came, and that's where a lot of our family indicators are going to be coming from. So next census, we'll be able to compare those because Canada stopped doing their census in 2011, FYI, which was a horrible decision, but now it's back up and running, so that's exciting. But all these TDSB, or Toronto District School Board variables are gonna be updated like right around now, so I'll be getting the data in a few months, and then I can start to analyze it. So something I've been thinking about is how do I make these, how can I show like all of these different indicators, and how can I show how they've changed? Because I think there's a lot, because people want to see how did they change geographically, how did they change just like as a static point, how did they change based on race, how did they change, like there's so many things. So that'll be like a fun project to think through how to display all of that. Yeah. Another cool thing is none of this data is actually owned by Children's Services. So it's all, again, back to that like needing the network to make this project meaningful. All of it is data that's owned by our network members. So there's a lot of sort of trust and partnership built in that data sharing. They're all through data sharing agreements. And yeah, it's kind of cool.
So kind of like to spin off on that question, it's good that it's a snapshot at the beginning of the data, and then come back years later to snapshot again to show the change over time. But what about in between?
Yeah.
Tracking that progress of, we've identified this subset of people who need additional resources, who's out there actually getting those resources, and are we tracking those resources to show that when we come back 5 years later, they actually got some help in between?
Yeah.
So is anybody tracking that social service aspect of it?
So that is a really good point, because all of that stuff, I mean, some of it is not being tracked 100%, but I mean, the social services side of it is where there's a lot of internal data, and that data is like not shared. So, for example, like for childcare, like we administer childcare fee subsidies to low-income families. We have a ton of rich data about who's getting those subsidies, how are they doing, how are they moving through the system, are they going into kindergarten, like what's happening there, but it's like highly identifiable and not really shared with people. The TDSB, even though they share the census, they won't share like their students' report card grades, or like in a way that we can start to track these kids in any way. Another example is like Ontario Work, so it's sort of like for people who are not, or it's, yeah, I guess welfare in a way, kind of. That data is also highly private, so we can't really see like who's going in. Another example is like the Children's Aid Societies are a partner on this network, and they do some cool sort of preventative work, community development preventative work, but again, they don't really share any of that data. So I think like a long-term goal would be trying to think about how can we have all of our sort of social services client data start to speak to each other, see how people are, like see how somebody who needs childcare fee subsidy is moving through the social housing world and the employment world. Like, are they getting employment? Are they getting housing? Like, what's happening there? And then what's like the outcome of their children? Or how does getting housing impact the children later on? Like, that stuff is really important and not really being tracked right now. Like in a connected way, yeah. Yeah. Planting it? Oh, blending it. Well, it's not, so I mean, so it's not blended by, so the children can't be joined together. So how we show it is we aggregate it up to, like for this dashboard, for example, we aggregate it up to our neighborhood level, so a geographic boundary based on where the child lives. So it's showing, all of this is showing like a percentage of children in that neighborhood are experiencing X, Y, or Z. By zip code. Yeah, it's called postal code in Canada, but same thing. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, so that's a really good question, because these neighborhoods are still huge, and I haven't done this. I haven't done it in terms of raising the village, but like when I work with internal stuff, I have done that, because what we see is like poverty, for example. We might like this. Recently, there was an issue. There was a childcare or a child and family program that needed to move in this neighborhood, and it's like a really low inequities neighborhood. And so by just looking at this map, you might say like, oh, you should move up into another neighborhood that maybe is higher need. But when you actually drill down, you see that there are still, in all of these neighborhoods, there's like pockets of like quite deep poverty. So sometimes it is definitely necessary to go deeper. The decision to do everything by neighborhood was this balance of making it, telling a story that was somewhat digestible, but then, yeah, so there's always this balance. I think like down the road allowing people, and actually this is something that a lot of people have talked about, is allowing people to kind of filter by their level of geography, because I know, for example, the Children's Aid Societies, they work by forward station address, which is like just a different geographic unit. And so they're kind of like, we want to see all of the same stuff, but we want to see it by that unit. Or our counselors are elected by wards, which are, again, a completely different made-up unit. They don't correspond with census tracts. So yeah, there's like the need to kind of be able to customize the level of geography, for sure. Something else I haven't. There's a lot, there's a lot. There's so much of where this project could go that it's like, feels sometimes just like a drop in the bucket. But it's still exciting, I think, sometimes. Yeah. Any other, yeah? Yeah, so this data actually is public facing. You can download all this data from this dashboard if you wanted, because it's all aggregated up to neighborhoods, so there's no identifiables. But there's also tons of cool data on Open Data Toronto. I think we've put some of this data on Open Data. So our Inequity score, which is like custom census data, and then we analyze it and index it, that's on Open Data, I believe. And I think all our EDI, the early development instrument data, is on there as it gets sent to me. So I think it's actually more drilled, you could drill down even more on that data if you wanted. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just more of a comment. Have you considered like maybe putting in like police information, like maybe calls or something like that?
Yeah.
Because that would be at least from my perspective, like a quick way to track like here's what our baseline was on 2015, here's what it is 2019.
Yeah. So we haven't thought specifically about calls because yeah, I guess it would be like percentage of calls, but there's a lot of various data that we want that we can't get. Police data, police data, there's some stuff that we would want, I think. But yeah, I mean, the calls thing is a good idea. So there's like the framework that we have for the child and family indicators. One of the things that we talked about a lot and decided not to do is that it would be child, family, and then community indicators. So community indicators would be things like green space, like police calls, I think would fit a little bit more under that. But the framework, kind of the experts wanted to keep it simple and just about children or families. Yeah. But it's a good point. And some data that we really want that the higher up governments are not giving us are things like graduation rates and suspension, expulsion rates, trying to get to show some of the like school to prison pipeline information but they like won't give us any of that. So yeah, part of my job is a lot of really annoying meetings with other people who have data who say no, so. Yeah.
First of all, I think this is amazing, and you've done a lot of progress that we haven't seen. So I know you feel like you have a long ways to go, but it's great.
Thanks.
And then sort of a follow-up to that, as a suggestion, have you talked to your local 211 about getting their data, because that gets to usually by the codes we're from a 211 LA.
Yeah.
What the callers' needs are.
Mm-hmm.
Usually some demographics as well.
Yeah, that's something that that's a really good point. I think there's a lot of this stuff that I need that I don't have the headspace to process sometimes, but I've thought about that. I haven't focused on it in any real way, but it's nice to hear it again, and I'm gonna follow up with 211 because I know that the guy that works there, so maybe there's an in. Awesome. Yeah.
Just know a good resource for other government examples. If you type in Tableau government across America, you'll see a link. It's not all our government customers, but examples. Of
Like
some of them.
across America? Oh. Tableau in the wild?
Yep.
Ooh.
Just examples of some of the government customers. They're public-facing examples, so if you scroll down, you can
Oh, cool.
provide, by health and services or public safety, and then each of those boxes takes you to the customer's website.
Oh, awesome. Cool. Thanks. This is good to know. Thank you. Yeah.
Has this impacted funding streams for the different neighborhoods? Do you think that it's taking more funding from the lighter blue areas
Ye-
more into the darker blue areas?
Yeah, so for children, for internally, I would say it has for sure. One of the things, so, but you can't see it. Anyways, the map is down, but like this is showing, again, these programs that are free, accessible drop-in child and family centers. We as Children's Services only just gained sort of the control to plan for them, but they're not equitably distributed in any way because they actually used to be universal, or they kind of are universal, I guess. Like the province wants them to be universal and any kid anywhere should have access to them, but we see it as being more like taking more of an equity approach and being sort of this really amazing resource that could help address this opportunity gap that we're seeing. So we know that lots of children aren't participating in other early learning experiences, and this could be an opportunity for those children to do that. So yeah, so we're actually starting to have serious discussions with many of these agencies about moving and using, and we don't really have the control to say like, you must move. And a lot of the time there are a lot of nuances that we don't understand on the ground. So they'll be like, you know, yeah, we might be in this neighborhood, but we actually serve a really high needs population. So we've been having conversations and slowly starting to just tweak sort of where some of these are located, or the hours sometimes is all it takes, or having mobile programs go back and forth between neighborhoods. So for that, the other one is that I think I said for funding, so there's an agency called United Way, and community organizations apply for funding from them, and they recommend, so United Way recommends agencies to use this to like support their application. So that kind of naturally, I think, helps it stream into these higher needs neighborhoods. Another one is public health uses it for their breastfeeding clinics. So again, they're like free, accessible drop-in programs that used to sort of be, there wasn't really a lot of logic in terms of where they were, and now they're taking a more equitable approach, I'd say, to where they are. Oh, another cool one is the libraries. So libraries are located in pretty much every neighborhood in Toronto, and I love libraries because I really feel like they're the last standing truly democratic institution in our world. But what they realized when they looked at the inequity score is that even though they might be located everywhere, the libraries with the shortest hours were located in the highest needs neighborhoods. So they're going through a process right now of being like, well, you know, should we maybe shorten the hours in where Drake lives and extend it over here? Like, does Drake use the library? Maybe not. Like, yeah, so these kinds of questions. Yeah, and I know I don't mean to like conflate the entire neighborhood to be like that, but I'm just trying to be funny. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you everybody for coming, and you can follow me on Twitter at, not me, it's the project, at TO Child Outcomes if you want to keep up with any of the new stuff, because there will be new stuff. Thank you.